Incidents in the life of Madame Blavatsky, compiled from information supplied by her relatives and her friends, and edited by A.P. Sinnett, author of Esoteric Buddhism, The Occult World, etc., etc., with a portrait reproduced from an original painting by Hermann Schmechen, London. George Redway, York Street, Covent Garden, 1886. Chapter 4. Madame de Jelihowsky's narrative continued.
It is impossible to give in detail even a portion of what was produced in the way of such phenomena during the stay of Madame Blavatsky amongst us in the town of Pskov, but they may be mentioned under general classification as follows. 1. Direct and perfectly clear written and verbal answers to mental questions or thought reading. 2. Prescriptions for different diseases in Latin and subsequent cures. 3. Private secrets unknown to all but the interested party, divulged, especially in the case of those persons who mentioned insulting doubts. 4. Change of weight in furniture and of persons at will. 5. Letters from unknown correspondents and immediate answers written to queries made and found in the most out-of-the-way mysterious places. Footnote. Thus a governess named Leontine, who wanted to know the fate of a certain young man she had hoped to be married to, learned what had become of him, his name, that she had purposely withheld, being given in full, from a letter written in an unknown handwriting she found in one of her locked boxes, placed inside the trunk equally locked. 6. Appearance and apport of objects, unclaimed by anyone present. 7. Sounds as of musical notes in the air, wherever Madame Blavatsky desired they should resound. All these surprising and inexplicable manifestations of an intelligent, and at times I should almost say an omniscient force, produced a sensation in Pskov, where there yet remain many who remember it well. Truth compels us to remark that the answers were not always in perfect accord with the facts, but seemed purposely distorted, as though for the purpose of making fun, especially of those querists who expected infallible prophecies. Nevertheless, the fact remains of the manifestation of an intelligent force, capable of perceiving the thoughts and feelings of any person, as also of expressing them by rappings and motions in inanimate objects. The following two occurrences took place in the presence of many eyewitnesses during the stay of Madame Blavatsky with us. As usual, those nearest and dearest to her were, at the same time, the most skeptical as to her occult powers. Her brother Leonid and her father stood out longer than all against evidence, until at last the doubts of the former were greatly shaken by the following fact. The drawing room of the Yahontovs was full of visitors. Some were occupied with music, others with cards, but most of us, as usual, with phenomena. Leonid Dehan did not concern himself with anything in particular, but was leisurely walking about, watching everybody and everything. He was a strong, muscular youth, saturated with the Latin and German wisdom of the university, and believed, so far, in no one and nothing. He stopped behind the back of his sister's chair and was listening to her narratives of how some persons, who called themselves mediums, made light objects become so heavy that it was impossible to lift them, and others, which were naturally heavy, became again remarkably light. "And you mean to say that you can do it?" ironically asked the young man of his sister.
Mediums can, and I have done it occasionally, though I cannot always answer for its success.
Coolly replied Madame Blavatsky. "But would you try?" asked somebody in the room, and immediately all joined in requesting her to do so.
I will try,
she said.
But I beg of you to remember that I promise nothing. I will simply fix this chess table and try. He who wants to make the experiment, let him lift it now, and then try again after I shall have fixed it.
"After you shall have fixed it," said a voice, "and what then? Do you mean to say that you will not touch the table at all?"
Why should I touch it?
Answered Madame Blavatsky with a quiet smile. Upon hearing the extraordinary assertion, one of the young men went determinedly to the small chess table and lifted it up as though it were a feather.
All right,
she said.
Now kindly leave it alone and stand back.
The order was at once obeyed, and a great silence fell upon the company. All, holding their breath, anxiously watched for what Madame Blavatsky would do next. She apparently, however, did nothing at all. She merely fixed her large blue eyes upon the chess table and kept looking at it with an intense gaze. Then, without removing her gaze, she silently, with a motion of her hand, invited the same young man to remove it. He approached and grasped the table by its leg with great assurance. The table could not be moved. He then seized it with both his hands. The table stood as though screwed to the floor. Then the young man, crouching down, took hold of it with both hands, exerting all his strength to lift it by the additional means of his broad shoulders. He grew red with the effort, but all in vain. The table seemed rooted to the carpet and would not be moved. There was a loud burst of applause. The young man, looking very much confused, abandoned his task and désespoir de cause and stood aside. Folding his arms in quite a Napoleonic way, he only slowly said, "Well, this is a good joke." "Indeed, it is a good one," echoed Leonid. A suspicion had crossed his mind that the young visitor was acting in secret confederacy with his sister and was fooling them. "May I also try?" he suddenly asked her.
"Please do, my dear,"
was the laughing response. Her brother, upon this, approached, smiling, and seized in his turn the diminutive table by its leg with his strong muscular arm. But the smile instantly vanished to give place to an expression of mute amazement. He stepped back a little and examined again very carefully the, to him, well-known chess table. Then he gave it a tremendous kick, but the little table did not even budge. Suddenly, applying to its surface his powerful chest, he enclosed it within his arms, trying to shake it. The wood cracked, but would yield to no effort. Its 3 feet seemed screwed to the floor. Then Leonid Han lost all hope, and abandoning the ungrateful task, stepped aside, and frowning, exclaimed but these 2 words, "How strange!" his eyes turning meanwhile with a wild expression of astonishment from the table to his sister. We all agreed that this exclamation was not too strong. The loud debate had meanwhile drawn the attention of several visitors, and they came pouring in from the drawing-room into the large apartment where we were. Many of them, old and young, tried to lift up, or even to impart some slight motion to, the obstinate little chess table. They failed, like the rest of us. Upon seeing her brother's astonishment, and perchance desiring finally to destroy his doubts, Madame Blavatsky, addressing him with her usual careless laugh, said,
"Try to lift the table now, once more."
Leonid Han approached the little thing very irresolutely, grasped it again by the leg, and pulling it upwards, came very nearly to dislocating his arm, owing to the useless effort. The table was lifted like a feather this time. Footnote: Madame Blavatsky has stated that this phenomenon could be produced in two different ways. First, through the exercise of her own will directing the magnetic currents so that the pressure on the table became such that no physical force could move it. And second, through the action of those beings with whom she was in constant communication and who, although unseen, were able to hold the table against all opposition. End footnote. And now to our second case. It occurred in St. Petersburg a few months later, when Madame Blavatsky had already left Pskov with her father and sister, and when all three were living in a hotel. They had come to St. Petersburg on business, on their way to Madame Yahontov's property in the district of Novorgev, where they had decided to pass the summer. All their forenoons were occupied with business, their afternoons and evenings with making and receiving visits, and there was no time for, or even mention of, phenomena. One night they received a visit from two old friends of their father. Both were old gentlemen, one of them a schoolfellow of the Corps des Pages, Baron M., the other the well-known K. Both were much interested in recent spiritualism, and were, of course, anxious to see something. Footnote: Skeptics who insist upon having the full names are invited to apply to the writer of the above, Madame de Jelihowsky, St. Petersburg, Zabalkansky Prospect, number 10 house, number 31 apartment. End footnote. After a few successful phenomena, the visitors declared themselves positively delighted, amazed, and quite at a loss what to make of Madame Blavatsky's powers. They could neither understand nor account, they said, for her father's indifference in presence of such manifestations. There he was, coolly laying out his grand patience with cards, while phenomena of such a wonderful nature were occurring around him. The old gentleman, thus taken to task, answered that it was all bosh, and that he would not hear of such nonsense, such occupation being hardly worthy of serious people, he added. The rebuke left the two old gentlemen unconcerned. They began, on the contrary, to insist that Colonel Han should, for old friendship's sake, make an experiment, before denying the importance or even the possibility of his daughter's phenomena. They offered him to test the intelligences and their power by writing a word in another room, secretly from all of them, and then asking the reps to repeat it. The old gentleman, more probably in the hope of a failure that would afford him the opportunity of laughing at his two old friends, than out of a desire to humor them, finally consented. He left his cards, and proceeding into an adjoining room, wrote a word on a bit of paper, after which, conveying it to his pocket, he returned to his patients and waited silently, laughing behind his grey moustache. "Well, our dispute will now be settled in a few moments," said K.W. "What shall you say, however, old friend, if the word written by you is correctly repeated? Will you not feel compelled to believe in such a case?"
What I might say if the word were correctly guessed, I could not tell at present,
he skeptically replied.
One thing I could answer, however, from the time I can be made to believe your alleged spiritism and its phenomena, I shall be ready to believe in the existence of the devil, undines, sorcerers, and witches, in the whole paraphernalia, in short, of old women's superstitions, and you may prepare to offer me as an inmate of a lunatic asylum.
Upon delivering himself thus, he went on with his patients, and paid no further attention to the proceedings. He was an old Voltairean, as the positivists who believed in nothing are called in Russia. But we, who felt deeply interested in the experiment, began to listen to the loud and unceasing raps coming from a plate brought there for the purpose. The younger sister was repeating the alphabet. The old general marked the letters down, while Madame Blavatsky did nothing at all, apparently. She was what would be called in our days a good writing medium. That is to say, she could write out the answers herself while talking with those around her, upon quite indifferent topics. But simple and more rapid as this mode of communication may be, she would never consent to use it. She was too afraid to employ it, fearing, as she explained, uncalled for suspicion from foolish people who did not understand the process. From the first, that is to say, almost from her childhood, and certainly in the days mentioned above, Madame Blavatsky, as she tells us, would, in such cases, see either the actual present thought of the person putting the questions, or its paler reflection, still quite distinct for her, of an event or a name, or whatever it was, in the past, as though hanging in a shadow world around the person, generally in the vicinity of the head. She had but to copy it consciously, or allow her hand to do so mechanically. At any rate, she never felt herself helped or led on by an external power. That is, no spirits helped her in this process after she returned from her first voyage, she avers. It seemed an action entirely confined to her own will, more or less consciously exercised by her, more or less premeditated and put into play. Whenever the thought of a person had to be communicated through raps, the process changed. She had to read, first of all, sometimes to interpret the thought of the querist, and having done so, to remember it well after it had often disappeared. Watch the letters of the alphabet as they were read or pointed out, prepare the will current that had to produce the rap at the right letter, and then have it strike at the right moment, the table or any other object chosen to be the vehicle of sounds or raps. A most difficult process, and far less easy than direct writing. By the means of raps and alphabet, we got one word, but it proved such a strange one, so grotesquely absurd, as having no evident relation to anything that might be supposed to have been written by her father, that all of us, who had been in the expectation of some complicated sentence, looked at each other, dubious whether we ought to read it aloud. To our question whether it was all, the raps became more energetic in the affirmative sounds. We had several triple raps, which meant in our code, yes, 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 yes. Remarking our agitation and whispering, Madame B.'s father looked at us over his spectacles and asked,
"Well, have you any answer? It must be something very elaborate and profound indeed."
He arose and, laughing in his moustache, approached us. His youngest daughter, Madame Yahontov, then went to him and said with some little confusion, "We only got one word."
"And what is it?"
Zaychik. Footnote. Zaychik means, literally, a little hare, while Zayts is the Russian term for any hare. In the Russian language, every substantive and adjective may be made to express the same thing, only in the diminutive. Thus, a house is dom, while small house is expressed by the word domik, and so on. End footnote. It was a sight indeed to witness the extraordinary change that came over the old man's face at this one word. He became deadly pale. Adjusting his spectacles with a trembling hand, he stretched it out while hurriedly saying,
"Let me see it. Hand it over. Is it really so?"
He took the slips of paper and read in a very agitated voice.
Zaychik. Yes, Zaychik, so it is. How very strange.
Taking out of his pocket the paper he had written upon in the adjoining room, he handed it in silence to his daughter and guests. They found on it both the question offered and the answer that was anticipated. The words read thus:
What was the name of my favorite war horse, which I rode during my first Turkish campaign?
And lower down, in parentheses,
Zaychik.
we felt fully triumphant and expressed our feelings accordingly. This solitary word, Zaychik, had an enormous effect upon the old gentleman. As it often happens with inveterate skeptics, once that he had found out that there was indeed something in his eldest daughter's claims, and that it had nothing to do whatever with deceit or juggling, having been convinced of this one fact, he rushed into the region of phenomena with all the zeal of an ardent investigator. As a matter of course, once he believed, he felt no more inclined to doubt his own reason. Having received from Madame Blavatsky one correct answer, her father became passionately fond of experimenting with his daughter's powers. Once he inquired of the date of a certain event in his family that had occurred several hundred of years before. He received it. From that time he set himself and Madame Blavatsky the difficult task of restoring the family chronology. The genealogical tree lost in the night of the First Crusades had to be restored from its roots down to his day. The information was readily promised, and he set to work from morning to night. First, the legend of the Count von Rothenstein, the Knight Crusader, was given him. The year, the month, and the day on which a certain battle with the Saracens had been fought, and how, while sleeping in his tent, the Knight Crusader was awakened by the cry of a cock, Han, to find himself in time to kill, instead of being stealthily killed by an enemy who had penetrated into his tent. For this feat, the bird, true symbol of vigilance, was raised to the honor of being incorporated in the coat of arms of the Counts of Rothenstein, who became from that time the Rothenstein von Rothan, to branch off later into the Han family and others. Then began a regular series of figures, dates of years and months, of hundreds of names by connection and side marriages, and a long line of descent from the Knight Crusaders down to the Countess Ida Han, Madame Blavatsky's father's cousin, and her father's family names and dates, as well as a mass of contemporary events which had taken place in connection with that family's descending line, were given rapidly and unhesitatingly. The greatest historian, endowed with the most phenomenal memory, could never be equal to such a task. How, then, could one who had been on cold terms from her very youth with simple arithmetic and history be suspected of deliberate deceit in a work that necessitated the greatest chronological precision, the knowledge very often of the most unimportant historical events, with their involved names and dates, all of which, upon the most careful verification, were found to be correct to a day? True, the family immigrants from Germany since the days of Peter III had a good many missing links and blanks in their genealogical tables. Yet, the few documents that had been preserved among the various branches of the family, in Germany and Russia, whenever consulted, were found to be the originals of those very exact copies furnished through Madame Blavatsky's reps. Her uncle, a high official at the General Post Office at St. Petersburg, whose great ambition in those days was to settle the title of a count on his eldest sons permanently, took the greatest interest in this mysterious work. Over and over again he would, in his attempts to puzzle and catch his niece in some historical or chronological inaccuracy, interrupt the regular flow of her reps, and ask for information about something which had nothing to do with the genealogy, but was only some contemporaneous fact. For instance,
You say that in the year 1572, Count Karl von Hanhan was married to the Baroness Ottilia so-and-so. This was in June at the castle of at Mecklenburg. Now, who was the reigning Kurfürst at that time? What prince reigned at some small German state? And who was the confessor of the Pope and the Pope himself in that year?
and the answer, always correct, would invariably come without a moment's pause. It was often found far more difficult to verify the correctness of such names and dates than to receive the information. Mr. J. A. Hahn, then post director at St. Petersburg, Madame Blavatsky's uncle, had to plunge for days and weeks sometimes into dusty old archives, write to Germany, and apply for information to the most out-of-the-way places that were designated to him when he found difficulties in his way to obtain the knowledge he sought for in easily obtainable books and records. This lasted for months. Never during that time were Madame Blavatsky's invisible helper or helpers found mistaken in any single instance.
Footnote by H.P. Blavatsky. Indeed not, for it was neither a spirit nor spirits, but living men who can draw before their eyes the picture of any book or manuscript wherever existing, and in case of need even that of any long-forgotten and unrecorded event, who helped Madame Blavatsky. The astral light is the storehouse and the record book of all things, and deeds have no secrets for such men. And the proof of it may be found in the production of Isis Unveiled. End footnote.
They only asked occasionally for a day or two to get at the correct information. Unfortunately, these records, put down on fly leaves and then copied into a book, are probably lost. The papers remained with Madame Blavatsky's father, who treasured them, and with many other far more valuable documents were stolen or lost after his death. But his sister-in-law, Madame Blavatsky's aunt, has in her possession letters from him in which he speaks enthusiastically of his experiments. One of the most startling of her phenomena happened very soon after Madame Blavatsky's return, in the early spring of 1858. Both sisters were then living with their father in their country house in a village belonging to Madame Yahontov. In consequence of a crime committed not far from the boundaries of my property, she writes, a man having been found killed in a gin shop, the murderers remaining unknown, the superintendent of the district police passed one afternoon through our village and stopped to make some inquiries. The researches were made very secretly, and he had not said one word about his business to anyone in the house, not even to our father. As he was an acquaintance who visited our family and stopped at our house on his district tour, no one asked him why he had come, for he made us very frequent visits, as to all the other proprietors in the neighborhood. It was only on the following morning, after he had ordered the village serfs to appear for examination, which proved useless, that the inmates learned anything of his mission. During tea, as they were all sitting around the table, there came the usual knocks, raps, and disturbance on the walls, the ceiling, and about the furniture of the room. To our father's question why the police superintendent should not try to learn something of the name and the whereabouts of the murderer from my sister's invisible agents, the officer, Captain O, only incredulously smiled. He had heard of the all-knowing spirits, but was ready to bet almost anything that these horned and hoofed gentlemen would prove insufficient for such a task. They would hardly betray and inform against their own, he added, with a silly laugh. This fling at her invisible powers, and laugh, as she thought, at her expense, made Madame Blavatsky change color and feel, as she said, an irrepressible desire to humble the ignorant fool who hardly knew what he was talking about. She turned fiercely upon the police officer.
And suppose I prove to you the contrary?
She defiantly asked him.
Then
He answered, still laughing.
I would resign my office and offer it to you, madame. Or still better, I would strongly urge the authorities to place you at the head of the secret police department.
Now, look here, Captain.
She said indignantly.
I do not like meddling in such a dirty business and helping you detectives. Yet since you defy me, let my father say over the alphabet and you put down the letters and record what will be rapped out. My presence is not needed for this, and with your permission, I will even leave the room.
She went away and, taking a book, placed herself on the balcony, apparently quite unconcerned with what was going on. Colonel Han, anxious to make a convert, began repeating the alphabet. The communication received was far from complimentary in its adjectives to the address of the police superintendent. The outcome of the message was that while he was talking nonsense at Rugodevo, the name of our new property, the murderer, whose name was Samoilo Ivanov, had crossed over before daylight to the next district and thus escaped the officer's clutches. At present he is hiding under a bundle of hay in the loft of a peasant named Andrew Vlasov of the village of Oreshkino. By going there immediately you will secure the criminal. The effect upon the man was tremendous. Our Stanovoi, district officer, was positively nonplussed and confessed that Oreshkino was one of the suspected villages he had on his list.
But allow me, however, to inquire.
He asked of the table from which the reps proceeded, and bending over it with a suspicious look upon his face,
How come you, whoever you are, to know anything of the murderer's name, or of that of the confederate who hides him in his loft? And who is Vlasov? For I know him not.
The answer came clear and rather contemptuous. Very likely that you should neither know nor see much beyond your own nose. We, however, who are now giving you the information, have the means of knowing everything we wish to know. Samoilo Ivanov is an old soldier on leave. He was drunk and quarreled with the victim. The murder was not premeditated. It is a misfortune, not a crime. Upon hearing these words, the superintendent rushed out of the house like a madman and drove off at a furious rate towards Oreshkino, which was more than 30 miles distant from Rugodevo. The information agreeing admirably with some points he had laboriously collected, and furnishing the last word to the mystery of the names given, he had no doubt in his own mind that the rest would prove true, as he confessed some time after. On the following morning, a messenger on horseback, sent by the Stanovoi, made his appearance with a letter to her father. Events in Oreshkino had proved every word of the information to be correct. The murderer was found and arrested in his hiding place at Andrew Vlasov's cottage, and identified as a soldier on leave named Samoilo Ivanov. This event produced a great sensation in the district, and henceforward the messages obtained, through the instrumentality of my sister, were viewed in a more serious light. But this brought, a few weeks after, very disagreeable complications, for the police of St. Petersburg wanted to know how could one, and that one a woman who had just returned from foreign countries, know anything of the details of a murder. It cost Colonel Han great exertion to settle the matter and satisfy the suspicious authorities that there had been no fouler play in the business than the intervention of supernatural powers, in which the police pretended, of course, to have no faith. Footnote: Madame Blavatsky denies point-blank any intervention of spirits in this case. She tells us she had the picture of the whole tragedy and its subsequent developments before her from the moment the Stanovoi entered the house. She knew the names of the murderers, the confederate, and of the village, for she saw them interlaced, so to say, with the visions. Then she guided the reps, and thus gave the information. End footnote. The most successful phenomena took place during those hours when we were alone, when no one cared to make experiments or sought useless tests, and when there was no one to convince or enlighten. At such moments, the manifestations were left to produce themselves at their own impulse and pleasure. None of us, not even the chief author of the phenomena under observation, at any rate as far as those present could see and judge from appearances, assuming any active part in trying to guide them. We very soon arrived at the conviction that the forces at work, as Madame Blavatsky constantly told us, had to be divided into several distinct categories. While the lowest on the scale of invisible beings produced most of the physical phenomena, the very highest among the agencies at work condescended but rarely to a communication or intercourse with strangers. The last named invisibles made themselves manifestly seen, felt, and heard only during those hours when we were alone in the family, and when great harmony and quiet reigned among us. It is said that harmony helps wonderfully toward the manifestation of the so-called mediumistic force, and that the effects produced in physical manifestations depend but little on the volition of the medium. Such feats as that accomplished with the little chess table at Pskov were rare. In the majority of the cases, the phenomena were sporadic, seemingly quite independent of her will, apparently never heeding anyone's suggestion, and generally expressed by those present. We used to feel extremely vexed whenever there was a chance to convince some highly intellectual investigator, but through H.P.B's obstinacy or lack of will, nothing came out of it. For instance, if we asked for one of those highly intellectual, profound answers we got so often when alone, we usually received in answer some impertinent rubbish. When we begged for the repetition of some phenomena she had produced for us hundreds of times before, our wish was only laughed at. I well remember how, during a grand evening party, when several families of friends had come from afar off, in some cases from distances of hundreds of miles, on purpose to witness some phenomena, to hear with their ears and see with their eyes the strange doings of Madame Blavatsky, the latter, though mockingly assuring us she did all she could, gave them no result to ponder upon. This lasted for several days. Footnote: She explains this by describing herself as tired and disgusted with the ever-growing public thirst for miracles. End. The visitors had left dissatisfied and in a spirit as skeptical as it was uncharitable. Hardly, however, had the gates been closed after them, the bells of their horses yet merrily tinkling in the last alley of the entrance park, when everything in the room seemed to become endowed with life. The furniture acted as though every piece of it was animated and gifted with voice and speech, and we passed the rest of the evening and the greater part of the night as though we were between the enchanted walls of the magic palace of some Scheherazade. It is far easier to enumerate the phenomena that did not take place during those forever memorable hours than to describe those that did. All those weird manifestations that we had observed at various times seemed to have been repeated for our sole benefit during that night. At one moment, as we sat at supper in the dining room, there were loud accords played on the piano which stood in the adjoining apartment, and which was closed and locked, and so placed that we could all of us see it from where we were through the large open doors. Then, at the first command and look of Madame Blavatsky, there came rushing to her through the air her tobacco pouch, her box of matches, her pocket handkerchief, or anything she asked or was made to ask for. Then, as we were taking our seats, all the lights in the room were suddenly extinguished, both lamps and wax candles, as though a mighty rush of wind had swept through the whole apartment. And when a match was instantly struck, there was all the heavy furniture, sofas, armchairs, tables, cupboards, and large sideboard, standing upside down, as though turned over noiselessly by some invisible hands, and not an ornament of the fragile carved work, nor even a plate broken. Hardly had we gathered our senses together after this miraculous performance, when we heard again someone playing on the piano, a loud and intelligible piece of music, a long marche de bravoure this time. As we rushed with lighted candles to the instrument, I mentally counting the persons to ascertain that all were present, we found, as we had anticipated, the piano locked, the last sounds of the final chords still vibrating in the air from beneath the heavy closed lid. After this, notwithstanding the late hour, we placed ourselves around our large dining table and had a séance. The huge family dining board began to shake with great force, and then to move, sliding rapidly about the room in every direction, even raising itself up to the height of a man. In short, we had all those manifestations that never failed when we were alone, that is, when only those nearest and dearest to H.P.B. were present, and none of the strangers who came to us attracted by mere curiosity, and often with a malevolent and hostile feeling. Among a mass of various and striking phenomena that took place on that memorable night, I will mention but two more. And here I must notice the following question made in those days, whenever my sister, Madame B, said to please us, for communications through raps. We were asked by her to choose what we would have. Shall we have the mediumistic or spook raps, or the raps by clairvoyant proxy? She asked. To make this clearer and intelligible, I must give her, Madame Blavatsky's, explanation of the difference. She never made a secret that she had been, ever since her childhood, and until nearly the age of 25, a very strong medium, though after that period, owing to a regular psychological and physiological training, she was made to lose this dangerous gift, and every trace of mediumship outside her will or beyond her direct control was overcome. She had two distinct methods of producing communications through raps. The one consisted almost entirely in her being passive and permitting the influences to act at their will, at which time the brainless elementals, the shells, would rarely, if ever, be allowed to come, owing to the danger of the intercourse. Chameleon-like, would reflect more or less characteristically the thoughts of those present and follow in a half-intelligent way the suggestions found by them in Madame B.'s mind. The other method, used very rarely, for reasons connected with her intense dislike to meddle with really departed entities, or rather to enter into their currents of thought, is this. She would compose herself, and seeking out with eyes shut, in the astral light, that current that preserved the genuine impress of some well-known departed entity, she identified herself for the time being with it, and, guiding the raps, made them to spell out that which she had in her own mind, as reflected from the astral current. Thus, if the rapping spirit pretended to be a Shakespeare, it was not really that great personality, but only the echo of the genuine thoughts that had once upon a time moved in his brain and crystallized themselves, so to say, in his astral sphere whence even his shell had departed long ago, the imperishable thoughts alone remaining. Not a sentence, not a word spelled by the raps, that was not formed first in her brain, in its turn the faithful copier of that which was found by her spiritual eye in the luminous record book of departed humanity. The, so to express it, crystallized essence of the mind of the once physical brain was there before her spiritual vision. Her living brain photographed it, and her will dictated its expression by guiding the reps, which thus became intelligent. And though few, if any of us then understood clearly what she meant, yet she would act either one way or the other, never uniting the two methods. We chose the former in this instance, the spook reps, as the easiest to obtain and affording us more amusement and to her less trouble. Thus, out of the many invisible and distinguished phantom visitors of that night, the most active and prominent among them was the alleged spirit of Pushkin. I beg the reader to remember that we never for a moment believed that spook to be really the great poet, whose earthly remains rest in the neighborhood of our Rugodevo, in the monk's territory known as the Holy Mountain. We had been warned by Madame Blavatsky, and knew well how much we could trust to the communications and conversation of such unseen visitors. But the fact of our having chosen for that séance the spook reps does not at all interfere with the truth of that other assertion of ours, namely, that whenever we wanted something genuine and resorted to the method of clairvoyant proxy, we had very often communications of great power and vigor of thought, profoundly scientific and remarkable in every way, made not by but in the spirit of the great defunct personage in whose name they given. It is only when we resorted to the spook reps that, notwithstanding and the world-known names of the eminent personages in which the goblins of the séance room love to parade, we got answers and discourses that might do honor to a circus clown, but hardly to a Socrates, a Cicero, or a Martin Luther.
Chapter 5. Madame de Jelihowsky's narrative continued.
I remember that we were deeply interested in those days in reading aloud in our little family circle the memoirs of Catherine Romanovna Dashkov, just then published. The interest of this remarkable historical work was greatly enhanced to us owing to the fact that our reading was very often interrupted by the alleged spirit of the authoress herself. The gaps and hiatuses of a publication, severely disfigured and curtailed by the censor's pen and scissors, were constantly filled up by comparing notes with her astral records. By the means of guided reps, Madame B, refusing as usual to help us by direct writing, preferring lazily to rest in her armchair, we received, in the name of the authoress, innumerable remarks, additions, explanations, and refutations. In some cases, her apparent and mistaken views in the days when she wrote her memoirs were corrected and replaced by more genuine thoughts. Footnote. The fact that many of the remarks and notes were different in their character from the original memoirs, and that errors and mistakes were corrected, can easily be explained. The old thoughts of Catherine Romanovna were expounded and corrected in the intellectual sphere of Madame B. The manner and nature of the expression would not cease to resemble that of the author, and, in the astral light, the original of the work, as conceived in the brain of the historian, would certainly be returned in preference to the mutilated views of the censor, while the brain of Madame B would supply the rest. End footnote. All such corrections and additional matter given fascinated us deeply by their profundity, their wit and humor, often, indeed, with a natural pathos that was one of the prominent features of this remarkable historical character. But I must return to my reminiscences of that memorable night. Thus, among other post-mortem visitors, we were entertained on that evening by A. Pushkin. The poet seemed to be in one of his melancholy and dark moments, and to our queries what was the matter, what made him suffer, and what we could do for him, he obliged us with an extemporary poem, which I preserved, although its character and style are beneath criticism. The substance of it, which is hardly worth translation, was to the effect that there was no reason for us to know his secret sufferings. Why should we try to know what he may be wishing for? He had but one desire, to rest on the bosom of death, instead of which he was suffering in great darkness for his sins, tortured by devils, and had lost all hope of ever reaching the bliss of becoming a winged cherub, and so on and so on. Footnote. In the recollection of Madame Blavatsky, this was a genuine spirit manifestation, that is, a clumsy personification of the great poet, by passing shells and spooks, allowed to merge into the circle for a few moments. The rhymed complaint speaking of hell and devils was the echo of the feelings and thoughts of a pious governess present. Most assuredly, it was not any reflection from Madame B.'s brain, nor would her admiring respect for the memory of the greatest Russian poet have ever allowed her to make such a blasphemous joke under the cover of his name. End footnote.
Poor Alexander Sergeyevich!
Exclaimed Colonel Khan upon hearing this wretched production read, and so saying he rose as though in search of something. "What are you looking for?" we asked.
My long pipe! I have had enough of these cigars, and I cannot find my pipe. Where can it be?
"You have just smoked it, after supper, father," I replied.
I did, and now Helen's spirits must have walked off with it or hidden it somewhere.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, affirmed triple raps around us, as though mocking the old gentleman.
Indeed? Well, this is a foolish joke. Could not our friend Pushkin tell us where he has hidden it? Do let us know, for life itself would be worthless on this earth without my old and faithful pipe.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, knocked the table. "'Is this you, Alexander Sergeyevich?" we asked. At this juncture, my sister frowned angrily, and the raps suddenly stopped. "No," she said after a moment's pause, "it is somebody else." And putting her hand upon the table, she set the raps going again. "Who is it, then?" "It is me, your old orderly, Your Honor, Voronov."
Ah, Voronov, very glad to meet you again, my good fellow. Now, try to remember old times. Bring me my pipe.
"I would be very happy to do so, Your Honor, but I am not able. Somebody holds me fast. But you can take it yourself, Your Honor. See, there it is, swinging over your head on the lamp." We all raised our heads. Verily, where a minute before there was nothing at all, there was now the huge Turkish pipe placed horizontally on the alabaster shade and balancing over it with its two ends sticking out at both sides of the lamp which hung over the dining table. This new physical demonstration filled with astonishment even those of us who had been accustomed to live in a world of marvels for months. Hardly a year before, we would not have believed even in the possibility of what we now regarded as perfectly proved facts. In the early part of the year 1859, as above stated, soon after her return to Russia, Madame Blavatsky went to live with her father and sister in a country house of a village belonging to Madame Jelihowsky at Rugodevo. Footnote. In the district of Novorzhev in the government of Pskov, about 200 versts from St. Petersburg. It was at that time a private property, a village of several hundred serfs, but soon after emancipation the land passed into other hands. End footnote. It had been bought only a year before by my deceased husband from parties entirely unknown to us till then, and through an agent, and therefore no one knew anything of their antecedents or even who they really were. It was quite unexpectedly that, owing to the sudden death of Monsieur Yahontov, I decided to settle in it for a time with my two baby sons, our father, and my two sisters, H.P. Blavatsky and Lisa, the youngest, our father's only daughter by another wife. I could therefore have no acquaintance with our neighbors or the landed proprietors of other villages, or with the relatives of the late owner of my property. All I knew was that Rugodevo had been bought from a person named Statkovsky, the husband of the granddaughter of its late owners, a family named Shusherin. Who were those Shusherins, the hereditary proprietors of those picturesque hills and mountains, of the dense pine forests, the lovely lakes, our old park, and nearly as old a mansion, from the top of which one could take a sweeping view of the country for 30 versts around? Its present proprietors could have no conception whatever, least of all H.P.B, who had been out of Russia for over 10 years and had just then returned. It was on the second or third evening after our arrival at Rugodevo. We were two of us walking along the side of the flower beds in front of the house. The ground floor windows looked right into the flower garden, while those of its three other sides were surrounded with large, old, shaded grounds. We had settled on the first floor, which consisted of 9 or 10 large rooms, while our elderly father occupied a suite of rooms on the ground floor on the right-hand side of the long entrance hall. The rooms opposite to his, on the left side, were uninhabited, and in the expectation of future visitors, stood empty, with their doors securely locked. The rooms occupied by the servants were at the back of the mansion and could not be seen from where we were. The windows of the empty apartment came out in bright relief, especially the room at the left angle, its windows, reflecting the rays of the setting sun in full glory, seemed illuminated through and through with the effulgence of the bright sunbeams. We were slowly walking up and down the gravel walk under the windows, and each time that we approached the angle of the house, my sister, H.P.B, looked into the windows with a strange searching glance and lingered on that spot, a puzzling expression and smile settling upon her face. Remarking at last her furtive glances and smiles, I wanted to know what it was that so attracted her attention in the empty room.
Shall I tell? Well, if you promise not to be frightened, then I may.
She answered hesitatingly. What reason have I to be frightened? Thank heaven, I see nothing myself. Well, and what do you see? Is it as usual visitors from the other world?
I could not tell you now, Vera, for I do not know them. But if my conjectures are right, they do seem, if not quite the dwellers themselves, at least the shadows of such dwellers from another, but certainly not from our world. I recognize this by certain signs.
What signs? Are their faces those of dead men? I asked, very nervously, I confess.
Oh, no,
She said.
For in such a case I should see them as dead people in their beds, or in their coffins. Such sights I am familiar with. But these men are walking about and look just as if alive. They have no mortal reason to remind me of their death, since I do not know who they are, and never knew them alive. But they do look so very antiquated. Their dresses are such as we see only on old family portraits. One, however, is an exception.
How does he look?
Well, this one looks as though he were a German student or an artist. He wears a black velvet blouse with a wide leather sash, long hair hanging in heavy waves down his back and shoulders. This one is quite a young man. He stands apart and seems to look quite in a different direction from where the others are.
We had now again approached the angle of the house, and halting, were both looking into the empty room through the bright window panes. It was brilliantly lit up by the sunbeams of the setting sun, but the room was empty, evidently, but only for one of us. For my sister, it was full of the images, probably of its long-departed late inmates. Madame Blavatsky went on looking thoughtfully and describing what she saw.
There, he looks in our direction. See,
She muttered.
he looks as though he's startled at seeing us. Now he is there no longer. How strange! He seems to have melted away in that sunbeam.
Let us call them out tonight and ask them who they are, I suggested.
We may, but what of that? Can any one of them be relied upon or believed? I would pay any price to be able to command and control as they, some personages I might name, do, but I cannot. I must fail for years to come.
She added regretfully. Who are they? Whom do you mean?
Those who know and can, not mediums.
She contemptuously added.
But look, what a sight. Oh, see what an ugly monster. Who can it be?
Now, what's the use in your telling me, look, and see? How can I look when I see nothing, not being a clairvoyant as you are? Tell me, how does that other figure appear? Only if it is something too dreadful, then you had better stop, I added, feeling a cold chill creeping over me. And, seeing she was going to speak, I cried out, Now pray, do not say anything more if it is too dreadful.
Don't be afraid. There is nothing dreadful in it. It only seemed to me so. They are there now. One, however, I can see very hazily. It is a woman, and she seems to be always merging into and again emerging from that shadow in the corner. Oh, there's an old lady standing there and looking at me as though she were alive. What a nice, kind, fat old thing she must have been. She has a white frilled cap on her head, a white kerchief crossed over her shoulders, a short grey narrow dress and a checked apron.
Why, you are painting some fancy portrait of the Flemish school, laughed I. Now look here, I am really afraid that you are mystifying me.
I swear I am not, but I'm so sorry that you cannot see.
Thanks, but I am not at all sorry. Peace be upon all those ghosts. How horrible.
Not at all horrible. They are all quite nice and natural, with the exception, maybe, of that old man.
Gracious, what old man?
A very, very funny old man, tall, gaunt, and with such a suffering look upon his worn-out face. And then it is his nails that puzzle me. What terrible long nails he has, or claws, rather. Why, they must be over an inch long.
Heaven help us, I could not help shrieking out. Whom are you describing? Surely it must be, I was going to say, the devil himself, but stopped short, overcome by a shudder. Unable to control my terror, I hastily left the place under the window and stood at a safe distance. The sun had gone down, but the gold and crimson flush of its departing rays lingered still, tinting everything with gold, the house, the old trees of the garden, and the pond in the background. The colors of the flowers seemed doubly attractive in this brilliant light, and only the angle of the old house, which cut the golden hue in two, seemed to cast a gloomy shadow on the glorious scene. H.P. Blavatsky remained alone behind that obscure angle, overshadowed by the thick foliage of an oak, while I sought a safe refuge in the glow of the large open space near the flower beds, and kept urging her to come out of her nook and enjoy instead the lovely panorama and look at the far-off wooded hills with their tops still glowing in the golden hue, on the quiet smooth ponds and the large dormant lake reflecting in its mirror-like waters the green chaotic confusion of its banks, and the ancient chapel slumbering in its nest of birch. My sister came out at last, pale and thoughtful. She was determined, she said, to learn who it was whom she had just seen. She felt sure the shadowy figures were the lingering reflections of people who had inhabited at some time those empty rooms.
I am puzzled to know who the old man can be,
she kept saying.
Why should he have allowed his nails to grow to such an extraordinary Chinese length? And then another peculiarity, he wears a most strange-looking black cap, very high, and something similar to the cloak of our monks.
Footnote: the round tiara covered with a long black veil worn by the Orthodox Greek monks. End footnote. Do let these horrid phantoms alone. Do not think of them.
Why? It is very interesting, the more so since I now see them so rarely. I wish I were still a real medium, as the latter, I am told, are constantly surrounded by a host of ghosts, and that I see them now but occasionally, not as I used to years ago when a child. Last night, however, I saw in Lisa's room a tall gentleman with long whiskers.
What? In the nursery room, near the children? Oh, please, drive him away from there at least. I do hope the ghost has only followed you there and has not made a permanent abode of that place. How you can keep so cool and feel no fear when you see is something I could never understand.
And why should I fear them? They're harmless in most cases, unless encouraged. Then I am too accustomed to such sights to experience even a passing uneasiness. If anything, I feel disgust and a contemptuous pity for the poor spooks. In fact, I feel convinced that all of us mortals are constantly surrounded by millions of such shadows, the last mortal image left of themselves by their ex-proprietors.
Then you think that these ghosts are all of them the reflection of the dead?
I am convinced of it. In fact, I know it.
Why then, in such a case, are we not constantly surrounded by those who are so near and dear to us, by our loved relatives and friends? Why are we allowed to be pestered only by a host of strangers, to suffer the uninvited presence of the ghosts of people whom we never knew, nor do we care for them?
A difficult query to answer. How often, how earnestly have I tried to see and recognize among the shadows that haunted me some one of our dear relatives or even a friend? Stray acquaintances and distant relatives for whom I care little, I have occasionally recognized. But they never seemed to pay any attention to me, and whenever I saw them, it was always unexpected and independently of my will. How I longed from the bottom of my soul. How I have tried, all in vain. As much as I can make out of it, it is not the living who attract the dead, but rather the localities they have inhabited, those places where they have lived and suffered, and where their personalities and outward forms have been most impressed on the surrounding atmosphere. Say, shall we call some of your old servants, those who have been born and lived in this place all their lives? I feel sure that if we describe to them some of the forms I have just seen, that they will recognize in them people they knew and who have died here.
The suggestion was good, and it was immediately put to the test. We took our seats on the steps of the entrance door and sent a servant to inquire who were the oldest serfs in the compound. An ancient tailor named Timothy, who lived for years exempt from any obligatory work on account of his services and old age, and the chief gardener, Ulian, a man about 60, soon made their appearance. I felt at first a little embarrassed, and put some commonplace questions, asking who it was who built one of the outhouses nearby. Then I put the direct query, whether there had ever lived in the house an old man, very strange to look at, with a high black headgear, terribly long nails, wearing habitually a long grey coat, etc., etc. No sooner had I given this description than the two old peasants, interrupting each other and with great volubility, exclaimed affirmatively that they knew well who it was whom the young mistress described. "Don't we know him? Of course we do. Why, it is our late barin, master, just as he used to be our deceased master, Nikolai Mikhailovich." "Statkovsky?" "No, no, mistress. Statkovsky was the young master, and he is not dead. He was our nominal master only, owing to his marriage with Natalia Nikolavna, our late master's, Nikolai Mikhailovich Shusherin's granddaughter. And, as you have described him, it is him for sure, our late master Shusherin." My sister and I interchanged a furtive glance. "We have heard of him," said I, unwilling to take the servants into our confidence, but did not feel sure it was he. But why was he wearing such a strange-looking cap and, as it seemed, never cut his nails? This was owing to a disease, mistress, an incurable disease, as we were told, that the late master caught while in Lithuania, where he had resided for years. It is called the coltun, if you have heard of it. He could neither cut his hair nor pare his nails, and had to cover constantly his head with a tall velvet cap like a priest's cap. The plica polonica, a terrible skin complaint, very common in Lithuania, and contracted only in its climate. The hair, as is well known, is grievously diseased, nor can the nails on the fingers and toes be touched, their cutting leading to a bleeding to death. "Well, and how did your mistress, Mrs. Shusherin, look?" The tailor gave a description in no way resembling the Dutch-looking old lady seen by Madame Blavatsky. Further cross-examination elicited, however, that the woman, in her semi-Flemish costume, was Mina Ivanovna, a German housekeeper, who had resided in the house for over 20 years, and the young man, who looked like a German student in his velvet blouse, was really such a student who had come from Göttingen. He was the youngest brother of Mr. Statkovsky, who had died in Rugodevo of consumption about 3 years before our arrival. This was not all, moreover. We found out that the corner room in which H.P.B. had seen on that evening, as she has later on many other occasions, The phantoms of all these deceased personages of Rugodevo had been made to serve for every one of them, either as a death chamber when they had breathed their last, or had been converted for their benefit into a mortuary chamber when they had been laid out awaiting burial. It was from this suite of apartments, in which their bodies had invariably passed from 3 to 5 days, that they had been carried away into yonder old chapel on the other side of the lake, that was so well seen and had been examined by us from the windows of our sitting room. Since that day, not only H.P.B, but even her little sister, Lisa, a child of 9 years old, saw more than once strange forms gliding noiselessly along the corridors of the old house, so full of lingering events of the past and of the images of those who had passed away from it. The child, strange to say, feared the restless ghosts no more than her elder sister, the former taking them innocently for living persons, and concerned but with the interesting problem where they had come from, who they were, and why no one except her old sister and herself ever consented to notice them. She thought this very rude, the little lady. Luckily for the child, and owing perhaps to the efforts of her sister, Madame Blavatsky, the faculty left her very soon, never to return during her subsequent life. As for Helena Petrovna, it never left her from her very childhood. So strong is this weird faculty in her, that it is a rare case when she has to learn of the death of a relative, a friend, or even an old servant of a family from a letter. We have given up advising her of any such sad events. The dead invariably precede the news, and tell her themselves of their demise, and we receive a letter in which she describes the way she saw this or that departed person, at the same time and often before the post carrying our notification could have reached her, as it will be shown further on. Footnote. The young lady is now over 30, and was saying but last year how lucky it was for her that she no longer saw these transterrestrial visitors. End footnote.
The pamphlet already referred to, Personal and Family Reminiscences by Madame Jelihowsky, may here be laid under contribution in reference to incidents taking place at the period we are now dealing with.
Having settled in our property at Rugodevo, we found ourselves as though suddenly transplanted into an enchanted world, in which we got gradually so accustomed to see self-moving furniture, things transferred from one place to another in the most inexplicable way, and to the strong interference with and presence in our matter-of-fact daily life of some unknown to us yet intelligent power, that we all ended by paying very little attention to it, though the phenomenal facts struck everyone else as being simply miraculous. Verily, habit becomes second nature with man. Our father, who had premised by saying that he gave permission to everyone to incarcerate him in a lunatic asylum on that day, that he would believe that a table could move, fly, or become rooted to the spot at the desire of those present, now passed his days and parts of his nights talking with Helen's spirits, as he called it. They informed him of numerous events and details pertaining to the lives of his ancestors, the Counts Hahn von Rothenstern-Hahn, offered to get back for him certain title deeds, and told us such interesting and witty anecdotes that unbelievers as well as believers could hardly help feeling interested. It often happened that my sister, being occupied with her reading, we, our father, the governess and myself, unwilling to disturb her, communicated with the invisible power mentally and in silence, simply thinking out our questions and writing down the letters rapped out either on the walls or the table near us. I remember having had a remarkable phenomenon of this kind at a station in the Sviaty Gore, Holy Mountains, where the poet A. Pushkine is buried, and when my sister was fast asleep. Things were told to me of which positively no one in this world could know anything, I alone being the depositary of these secrets, together with an old gentleman living for years on his faraway property. I had not seen him for 6 years. My sister had never heard of him, as I had made his acquaintance 2 years after she had left Russia. During that mental conversation, names, dates, and the appellation of his property were given to me. I had thought and asked, "Where is he who loved me more than anyone on this earth?" Easy to know that I had my late husband in my mind. Instead of that, I received in answer a name I had long forgotten. First I felt perplexed, then indignant, and finally the idea became so comical that I burst out in a fit of laughter that awoke my sister. "How can you prove to me that you do not lie?" I asked my invisible companions. "Remember the second volume of Byron's poetry," was the answer I received. I became cold with horror. No one had ever been told of it, and I myself had forgotten for years that circumstance which was now told to me in all its details, namely, that being in the habit of sending books, and a series of English classics for me to read, that gentleman, old enough to be my grandfather, had thought of offering marriage to me, and found no better means for it than by inserting in volume 2 of Byron's works a letter to that effect. Of course, my informers, whoever they were, played upon me a wicked trick by reminding me of these facts, yet their omniscience had been brilliantly proven to me by them in this case. It is most extraordinary that our silent conversations with that intelligent force that had ever manifested itself in my sister's presence were found by us the most successful during her sleep, or when she was very ill. Once, a young physician, who visited us for the first time, got so terribly frightened at the noises and the moving about of things in her room, when she was on her bed lying cold and senseless, that he nearly fainted himself. Such tragicomical scenes happened very often in our house, but the most remarkable of all such have already been told in the pages of the Redus in 1883, as having taken place during her 2 years' stay with us. As an eyewitness, I can only once more testify to all the facts described, without entering upon the question of the agency that produced them, or the nature of the agents. But I may recall some additional inexplicable phenomena that occurred at that time, testified to by other members of our family, though some of them I have not witnessed myself. All the persons living on the premises with the household members saw constantly, often in full noonday, vague human shadows walking about the rooms, appearing in the garden, in the flower beds in front of the house, and near the old chapel. My father, once the greatest skeptic, Mademoiselle Leontine, the governess of our younger sister, told me many a time that they had just met and seen such figures quite plainly. Moreover, Leontine found very often in her locked drawers and her trunks some very mysterious letters, containing family secrets known to her alone, over which she wept, reading them incessantly during whole weeks, and I am forced to confess that once or twice the events foretold in them came to pass as they had been prophesied to us. Some comments on various parts of the foregoing narrative, furnished by Madame Blavatsky herself, will here be read with interest. She says she has tried with the most famous mediums to evoke and communicate with those dearest to her, and whose loss she had deplored, but could never succeed. Communications and messages she certainly did receive, and got their signatures, and on 2 occasions their materialized forms, but the communications were couched in a vague and gushing language, quite unlike the style she knew so well. Their signatures, as she has ascertained, were obtained from her own brain, and on no occasion, when the presence of a relation was announced and the form described by the medium, who was ignorant of the fact that Madame Blavatsky could see as well as any of them, has she recognized the spirit of the alleged relative in the host of spooks and elementaries that surrounded them, when the medium was a genuine one, of course. Quite the reverse, for she often saw, to her disgust, how her own recollections and brain images were drawn from her memory and disfigured in the confused amalgamation that took place between their reflection in the medium's brain, which instantly sent them out, and the shells which sucked them in like a sponge and objectivized them. A hideous shape with a mask on in my sight, she tells us.
Even the materialized form of my uncle at the Eddies was the picture. It was I who sent it out from my own mind, as I had come out to make experiments without telling it to anyone. It was like an empty outer envelope of my uncle that I seemed to throw on the medium's astral body. I saw and followed the process. I knew Will Eddy was a genuine medium and the phenomenon as real as it could be, and therefore when days of trouble came for him, I defended him in the papers. In short, for all the years of experience in America, I never succeeded in identifying in one single instance those I wanted to see. It is only in my dreams and personal visions that I was brought in direct contact with my own blood relatives and friends, those between whom and myself there had been a strong mutual spiritual love.
Her conviction, therefore, based as much on her personal experience as on that of the teachings of the occult doctrine, is as follows.
For certain psychomagnetic reasons too long to be explained here, the shells of those spirits who loved us best will not, with a very few exceptions, approach us. They have no need of it, since unless they were irretrievably wicked, they have us with them in devashan, that state of bliss in which the monads are surrounded with all those and that which they have loved, objects of spiritual aspirations as well as human entities. Shells once separated from their higher principles have naught in common with the latter. They are not drawn to their relatives and friends, but rather to those with whom their terrestrial, sensuous affinities are the strongest. Thus, the shell of a drunkard will be drawn to one who is either a drunkard already or has a germ of this passion in him, in which case they will develop it by using his organs to satisfy their craving. One who died full of sexual passion for a still living partner will have its shell drawn to him or her, etc. We theosophists, and especially occultists, must never lose sight of the profound axiom of the esoteric doctrine which teaches us that it is we, the living, who are drawn toward the spirits, but that the latter can never, even though they would, descend to us, or rather into our sphere.
Chapter 6. Madame de Jelihowsky's Narrative. Continued.
The quiet life of the sisters at Rugadeva was brought to an end by a terrible illness which befell Madame Blavatsky. Years before, perhaps during her solitary travels in the steppes of Asia, she had received a remarkable wound. We could never learn how she had met with it. Suffice to say that the profound wound reopened occasionally, and during that time she suffered intense agony, often bringing on convulsions and a death-like trance. The sickness used to last from 3 to 4 days, and then the wound would heal as suddenly as it had reopened, as though an invisible hand had closed it, and there would remain no trace of her illness. But the affrighted family was ignorant at first of this strange peculiarity, and their despair and fear were great indeed. A physician was sent for to the neighboring town, but he proved of little use, not so much indeed through his ignorance of surgery, as owing to a remarkable phenomenon which left him almost powerless to act through sheer terror at what he had witnessed. He had hardly examined the wound of the patient prostrated before him in complete unconsciousness, when suddenly he saw a large dark hand between his own and the wound he was going to anoint. The gaping wound was near the heart, and the hand kept slowly moving at several intervals from the neck down to the waist. To make his terror worse, there began suddenly in the room such a terrific noise, such a chaos of noises and sounds from the ceiling, the floor, window panes, and every bit of furniture in the apartment, that he begged he might not be left alone in the room with the insensible patient. In the spring of 1860, both sisters left Rugadeva for the Caucasus, on a visit to their grandparents, whom they had not seen for long years. During the 3 weeks' journey from Moscow to Tiflis, performed in a coach with post horses, there occurred many a strange manifestation. At Zadonsk, the territory of the Cossack army of the Don, a place of pilgrimage in Russia, where the holy relics of Saint Tikhon are preserved, we halted for rest, and I prevailed upon my lazy sister to accompany me to the church to hear the Mass. We had learned that on that day church service would be conducted near the said relics by the then Metropolitan of Kiev, at present, in 1884, the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg. One of the 3 popes of Russia, so to say, the highest of the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the Orthodox Greek Church, the famous and learned Isidore, now a man past 90 years of age, whom both of us had well known in our childhood and youth at Tiflis, where he was for so many years the Exarch of Georgia, Caucasus, the spiritual chief of all the archbishops, and the head of the church in Georgia. He had been a friend of our family for years, and had often visited us. During service, the venerable old man recognized us, and immediately dispatched a monk after us, with an invitation to visit him at the Lord Archbishop's house. He received us with great kindness. But hardly had we taken our seats in the drawing room of the Holy Metropolitan, then a terrible hubbub, noises, and loud raps in every conceivable direction burst suddenly upon us with a force to which even we were hardly accustomed. Every bit of furniture in the big audience room cracked and thumped. From the huge chandelier under the ceiling, every one of whose crystal drops seemed to become endowed with self-motion, down to the table, and under the very elbows of His Holiness, who was leaning on it. Useless to say how confused and embarrassed we looked, though truth compels me to say that my irreverent sister's embarrassment was tempered with a greater expression of fun than I would have wished for. The Metropolitan Isidore saw at a glance our confusion, and understood, with his habitual sagacity, the true cause of it. He had read a good deal about the so-called spiritual manifestations, and on seeing a huge armchair gliding toward him, laughed, and felt a good deal interested in this phenomenon. He inquired which of us two sisters had such a strange power, and wanted to know when and how it had begun to manifest itself. We explained to him all the particulars as well as we could, and after listening very attentively, he suddenly asked Madame Blavatsky if she would permit him to offer her invisible a mental question. Of course, His Holiness was welcome to it, she answered. We do not feel at liberty to publish what the question was. But when his very serious query had received an immediate answer, precise and to the very point he wanted it to be, His Holiness was so struck with amazement and felt so anxious and interested in the phenomenon that he would not let us go, and detained us with him for over 3 hours. He had even forgotten his dinner. Giving orders not to be interrupted, the venerable gentleman continued to hold conversation with his unseen visitors, expressing all the while his profound astonishment at their all-knowledge. Footnote: Всенайство. The word used can hardly be translated by the term omniscience. It is an attribute of a less absolute character, and refers to the things of the earth. End footnote. When bidding goodbye to us, the venerable old man blessed the travelers, and turning to Madame Blavatsky, addressed to her these parting words. As for you, let not your heart be troubled by the gift you are possessed of, nor let it become a source of misery to you hereafter, for it was surely given to you for some purpose, and you could not be held responsible for it. Quite the reverse, for if you but use it with discrimination, you will be enabled to do much good to your fellow creatures. These are the authentic words of His Holiness Isidore, the Metropolitan of our Orthodox Greek Church of Russia, addressed by him in my presence to my sister, Madame Blavatsky. Footnote: The Russian censor has not allowed this letter to appear in the rebus in the original. End footnote. At one of the stations where we had to change horses, the station master told us very brutally that there were no fresh horses for us, and that we had to wait. The sun had not yet gone down, it was full moon, the roads were good, and with all this we were made to lose several hours. This was provoking. Nevertheless, there was nothing to be done, the more so as the station master, who was too drunk to be reasoned with, had found fit to disappear and refused to come and talk with us. We had to take the little unpleasantness as easily as we could, and settle ourselves as best we knew how for the night. But even here we found an impediment. The small station house had but one room for the travelers, near a hot and dirty kitchen, and even that one was locked and bolted, and no one would open the door for us without special orders. Madame Blavatsky was beginning to lose patience.
Well, this is fine,
She went on.
We are refused horses, and even the room we are entitled to is shut for us. Why is it shut? Now I want to know and insist upon it.
But there was no one to tell us the reason why, for the station house seemed utterly empty, and there was not a soul to be seen about. H.P.B. approached the little low windows of the locked room and flattened her face against the window panes.
Aha!
She suddenly exclaimed.
That's what it is. Very well, then. And now I can force the drunken brute to give us horses in 5 minutes.
And she started off in search of the station master. Curious to know what secret there was in the mysterious room, I approached the window in my turn and tried to fathom its unknown regions. But although the inside of the room was perfectly visible through the window, yet my uninitiated eyes could see nothing in it save the ordinary furniture of a dirty station house, dirty as they all are. Nevertheless, to my delight and surprise, 10 minutes had not passed when 3 excellent and strong post horses were brought out under the supervision of the station master himself, who, pale and confused, had become, as though by magic, polite and full of obsequiousness. In a few minutes our carriage was ready, and we continued our journey. To my question what sorcery had helped her to achieve such change in the drunken station master, who but a moment before would pay no attention to us, Madame Blavatsky only laughed.
Profit and ask no questions,
She said.
Why should you be so inquisitive?
It was but on the following day that she condescended to tell me that the wretched station master must have most certainly taken her for a witch. It appears that upon finding him in a backyard, she had shouted to him that the person whose body had been just standing in a coffin in the traveller's room was there again, and asked him not to detain us, for we would otherwise insist upon our right to enter into the room and would disturb her spirit thereby. And when the man upon hearing this opened his eyes, without appearing to understand what she was referring to, Madame Blavatsky hastened then to tell him that she was speaking of his deceased wife, whom he had just buried, and who was there and would be there in that room until we had gone away. She then proceeded to describe the ghost in such a minute way that the unfortunate widower became as pale as death itself and hurried away to order fresh horses. Some interesting details concerning Madame Blavatsky's family home at Tiflis have been published quite lately in a Russian memoir, Reminiscences of Prince A.T. Baryatinsky, by General P.S. Nikolaev, formerly his aide-de-camp at Tiflis. This memoir appears in the historical Viesnik, Messenger, a Russian magazine of high repute, dedicated, as its name shows, to historical notes, memoirs, and biographies. Referring to the family of the Fadivs, General Nikolaev, writing of a period coincident with that of Madame Blavatsky's visit to Tiflis, says,
They were living in those years in the ancient mansion of the Princess Chevchevadze, the great building itself carrying the imprint of something weird or peculiar about it, something that carried one back to the epoch of Catherine the Great. A long, lofty and gloomy hall was hung with the family portraits of the Fadivs and the Princess Dolgorouki. Further on was a drawing room, its walls covered with goblin tapestry, a present from the Empress Catherine, and near at hand was the apartment of Milei Nyafadev, in itself one of the most remarkable of private museums. The collection gathered into this museum attracted attention by their great variety. They were brought together the arms and weapons from all the countries of the world, ancient crockery, cups and goblets, archaic house utensils, Chinese and Japanese idols, mosaics and images of the Byzantine epoch, Persian and Turkish carpets, and fabrics worked with gold and silver, statues, pictures, paintings, petrified fossils, and finally, a very rare and most precious library. The emancipation of the serfs had altered in no way the daily life of the Fadivs. The whole enormous host of their vaditai, ex-serfs, having remained with the family as before their freedom, only now receiving wages, and all went on as before with the members of that family, that's to say, luxuriously and plentifully. It means in their usual hospitable and open way of living.
Footnote: 40 men and women, and this for 22 years in Tiflis, where old General Fadev was one of the 3 imperial councillors on the council under the viceroys from Prince Parantsov to the Grand Duke Michael. End footnote.
I loved to pass my evenings in that home. At precisely 11:15, the old general, brushing along the Zargets with his warmly muffled up feet, retired to his apartments. At that same moment, hurriedly and in silence, The supper was brought in on trays and served in the interior rooms, and immediately after this, the drawing room doors would be closely shut, and an animated conversation take place on every topic. Modern literature was reviewed and criticized, contemporary social questions from Russian life discussed. At one time it was the narratives of some visitor, a foreign traveler, or an account given of a recent skirmish by one of its heroes, some sunburned officer just returned from the battlefield in the Caucasian mountains, would be eagerly listened to. At another time, the antiquated old Spanish mason, then an officer in the Russian army, Quartano, would drop in and give us thrilling stories from the wars of Napoleon the Great. Or again, Rada Bey, H.P. Blavatsky, the granddaughter of General A.M. Fadeev, would put in an appearance and was made to call forth from her past some stormy episode of her American life and travels, when the conversation would be sure to turn suddenly upon mystic subjects, and she herself commenced to evoke spirits. And then the tall candles would begin to burn low, hardly flickering towards the end. The human figures on the goblin tapestry would seem to awaken and move, and each of us feel queer from an involuntary creeping sensation. And this generally lasted until the eastern portion of the sky began itself to pale on the dark face of the southern night.
Madame Blavatsky resided at Tiflis less than 2 years and not more than 3 in the Caucasus. The last year she passed roaming about in Imeretia, Georgia, and Mingrelia. Throughout the Transcaucasian country and all along the coast of the Black Sea, the various peoples, notwithstanding that their Christian persuasion dates from the 4th century AD, are as superstitious as any pagan, especially the half-savage, warlike Abkhazians, the Imeretenis, and the Mingrelians, the descendants perhaps of those ancient Greeks who came with Jason in search of the Golden Fleece. For, according to historical legend, it is the site of the archaic Colchid, and the river Rion, Pharsis, rolled once upon a time its rapid waves upon golden sand and ore instead of the modern gravel and stones. Therefore, it was but natural that the princes and the landed noblemen, who live in their castles scattered through and stuck like nests in thick foliage, in the dense woods and forests of Mingrelia and Imeretia, and who, hardly half a century back, were nearly all half-brigands when not full-blown highwaymen, who are fanatical as Neapolitan monks and ignorant as Italian noblemen, that they should, we say, have viewed such a character as was then Madame Blavatsky in the light of a witch, when not in that of a beneficent magician. As, later in life, wherever she went, her friends in those days were many, but her enemies still more numerous. If she cured and helped those who believed themselves sincerely bewitched, it was only to make herself cruel enemies of those who were supposed to have bewitched and spoiled the victims. Refusing the presence and thanks of those she relieved of the evil eye, she rejected at the same time, with equal contempt, the bribes offered by their enemies. No one, at any rate, and whatever her other faults may be, has succeeded in showing her a mercenary character or one bent upon money-making for any motive. Thus, while people of the class of the princes Guriel and of the princes Dadiani and Abashetse were ranked among her best friends, some others, all those who had a family hatred for the above-named, were, of course, her sworn enemies. In those days, we believe even now, these countries, especially Mingrelia and Imeretia, were regular hotbeds of titled paupers, of princes, descendants of deposed and conquered sovereigns, and feud raged among them as during the Middle Ages. These were and have remained her enemies. Some years later to these were added all the bigots, churchgoers, missionaries, to say nothing of American and English spiritualists, French spiritists, and their host of mediums. Stories after stories were invented of her, circulated and accepted by all, except those who knew her well, as facts. Calumny was rife, and her enemies now hesitate at no falsehood that can injure her character. She defied them all and would submit to no restraint, would stoop to adopt no worldly method of propitiating public opinion. She avoided society, showing her scorn of its idols, and was therefore treated as a dangerous iconoclast. All her sympathies went toward and with that tabooed portion of humanity which society pretends to ignore and avoid, while secretly running after its more or less renowned members, the necromancers, the obsessed, the possessed, and such like mysterious personages. The native Kudzani, magicians, sorcerers, Persian thaumaturgists, and old Armenian hags, healers and fortune-tellers, were the first she generally sought out and took under her protection. Finally, public opinion became furious, and society, that mysterious somebody in general and nobody in particular, made an open levy of arms against one of its own members who dared to defy its time-hallowed laws and act as no respectable person would, namely, roaming in forests alone, on horseback, and preferring smoky huts and their dirty inmates to brilliant drawing rooms and their frivolous denizens. Her occult powers, all this while, instead of weakening, became every day stronger, and she seemed finally to subject to her direct will every kind of manifestation. The whole country was talking of her. The superstitious Guriel and Mingrelian nobility began very soon to regard her as a magician, and people came from afar off to consult her about their private affairs. She had long since given up communication through raps, and preferred, what was a far more rapid and satisfactory method, to answer people either verbally or by means of direct writing. Footnote. This was done always in full consciousness and simply, as she explained, watching people's thought as they evolved out of their heads in spiral luminous smoke, sometimes in jets of what might be taken for some radiant material and settled in distinct pictures and images around them. Often, such thoughts and answers to them would find themselves impressed in her own brain, couched in words and sentences in the same way as original thoughts do. But, so far as we are all able to understand, the former visions are always more trustworthy, as they are independent and distinct from the seer's own impressions, belonging to pure clairvoyance, not thought transference, which is a process always liable to get mixed up with one's own more vivid mental impressions. End footnote. At times, during such process, Madame Blavatsky seemed to fall into a kind of coma, or magnetic sleep, with eyes wide open, though even then her hand never ceased to move and continued its writing. Footnote. Very naturally, she explains,
since it was neither magnetic sleep nor coma, but simply a state of intense concentration, an attention only too necessary during such concentration when the least distraction leads to a mistake. People knowing but of mediumistic clairvoyance and not of our philosophy and mode of operation often fall into such error.
End footnote. When thus answering to mental questions, the answers were rarely unsatisfactory. Generally, they astonished the querists, friends and enemies. Meanwhile, sporadic phenomena were gradually dying away in her presence. They still occurred, but very rarely, though they were always very remarkable. We give one. It must, however, be explained that some months previous to that event, Madame Blavatsky was taken very ill. From the verbal statements of her relatives, recorded under their dictation, we learn that no doctor could understand her illness. It was one of those mysterious nervous diseases that baffle science and elude the grasp of everyone but a very expert psychologist. Soon after the commencement of that illness, she began, as she repeatedly told her friends, to lead a double life. What she meant by it, no one of the good people of Mingrelia could understand, of course. But this is how she herself describes that state.
Whenever I was called by name, I opened my eyes upon hearing it, and was myself my own personality in every particular. As soon as I was left alone, however, I relapsed into my usual half-dreamy condition and became somebody else.
Who, namely, Madame B will not tell.
I had simply a mild fever that consumed me slowly but surely, day after day, with entire loss of appetite and finally of hunger, as I would feel none for days, and often went a week without touching any food whatever, except a little water, so that in 4 months I was reduced to a living skeleton. In cases when I was interrupted, when in my other self, by the sound of my present name being pronounced, and while I was conversing in my dream life, say at half a sentence either spoken by me or those who were with my second me at the time, and opened my eyes to answer the call, I used to answer very rationally and understood all, for I was never delirious. But no sooner had I closed my eyes again than the sentence which had been interrupted was completed by my other self, continued from the word, or even half the word, it had stopped at. When awake, and myself, I remembered well who I was in my second capacity, and what I had been and was doing. When somebody else, that is, the personage I had become, I know I had no idea of who was H.P. Blavatsky. I was in another far-off country, a totally different individuality from myself, and had no connection at all with my actual life.
Such is Madame Blavatsky's analysis of her state at that time. She was residing then at Ozorgheti, a military settlement in Mingrelia, where she had bought a house. It is a little town, lost among the old forests and woods, which in those days had neither roads nor conveyances, save of the most primitive kind, and which, to the very time of the last Russo-Turkish war, was unknown outside of Caucasus. The only physician of the place, the army surgeon, could make nothing of her symptoms, but as she was visibly and rapidly declining, he packed her off to Tiflis to her friends. Unable to go on horseback, owing to her great weakness, and the journey in a cart being deemed dangerous, she was sent off in a large native boat along the river, a journey of 4 days to Kutaisi, with 4 native servants only to take care of her. What took place during that journey we are unable to state precisely, nor is Madame Blavatsky herself certain of it, since her weakness was so great that she lay like one apparently dead until her arrival. In that solitary boat, on a narrow river, hedged on both sides by centenarian forests, her position must have been precarious. The little stream they were sailing along was, though navigable, rarely, if ever, used as a means of transit, at any rate not before the war. Hence the information we have got came solely from her servants and was very confused. It appears, however, that as they were gliding slowly along the narrow stream, cutting its way between 2 steep and woody banks, the servants were several times during 3 consecutive nights frightened out of their senses by seeing, what they swore was their mistress, gliding off from the boat and across the water in the direction of the forests, while the body of that same mistress was lying prostrate on her bed at the bottom of the boat. Twice the men who towed the canoe, upon seeing the form, ran away shrieking and in great terror. Had it not been for a faithful old servant who was taking care of her, the boat and the patient would have been abandoned in the middle of the stream. On the last evening, the servant swore he saw 2 figures, while the third, his mistress, in flesh and bone, was sleeping before his eyes. No sooner had they arrived at Kutaisi, where Madame Blavatsky had a distant relative residing at that place, than all the servants, with the exception of the old butler, left her and returned no more. It was with great difficulty that she was transported to Tiflis. A carriage and a friend of the family were sent to meet her, and she was brought into the house of her friends, apparently dying. She never talked upon that subject with anyone, but as soon as she was restored to life and health, she left the Caucasus and went to Italy. Yet it was before her departure from the country in 1863 that the nature of her powers seems to have entirely changed. One afternoon, very weak and delicate still, after the illness just described, Madame Blavatsky came into her aunt's, née de Fadiv's, room. After a few words of conversation, remarking that she felt tired and sleepy, she was offered to rest upon a sofa. Hardly had her head touched her cushion when she fell into a profound sleep. Her aunt had quietly resumed some writing she had interrupted to talk with her niece, when suddenly soft but quite audible steps in the room behind her chair made her rapidly turn her head to see who was the intruder, as she was anxious that Madame Blavatsky should not be disturbed. The room was empty. There was no other living person in it but herself and her sleeping niece, yet the steps continued audibly, as though of a heavy person treading softly, the floor creaking all the while. They approached the sofa and suddenly ceased. Then she heard stronger sounds, as though someone was whispering near Madame Blavatsky, and presently a book placed on a table near the sofa was seen by née de Fadiv to open, and its pages kept turning to and fro, as if an invisible hand were busy at it. Another book was snatched from the library shelves and flew in that same direction. More astonished than frightened, for everyone in the house had been trained in and become quite familiar with such manifestations, née de Fadiv arose from her armchair to awaken her niece, hoping thereby to put a stop to the phenomena. But at the same moment a heavy armchair moved at the other end of the room and, rattling on the floor, glided toward the sofa. The noise it made awoke Madame Blavatsky, who, upon opening her eyes, inquired of the invisible presence what was the matter. A few more whisperings, and all relapsed into quietness and silence, and there was nothing more of the sort during the rest of the evening. At the date at which we write, every phenomenon independent of her will, except such as the one described, and that Madame Blavatsky attributes to quite a different cause than spiritual manifestations, has for more than 20 years entirely ceased. At what time this complete change in her occult powers was wrought, we are unable to say, as she was far away from our observation and spoke of it but rarely, never unless distinctly asked in our correspondence to answer the question. From her letters we learned that she was always traveling, rarely settling for any length of time in one place, and we believe her statements with regard to her powers to have been entirely true when she wrote to tell us,
Now, in 1866, I shall never be subjected to external influences.
It is not H.P.B. who was from that time forth victim to influences, which would have without doubt triumphed over a less strong nature than was hers. But, on the contrary, it is she who subjected these influences, whatever they may be, to her will.
The last vestiges of my psychophysical weakness is gone, to return no more.
Writes Madame Blavatsky in a letter to a relation.
I am cleansed and purified of that dreadful attraction to myself of stray spooks and ethereal affinities. I am free, thanks to those whom I now bless at every hour of my life.
I believe in this statement, said in a conversation in May 1884 at Paris, her sister, Madame Jelihowsky, the more so as for nearly 5 years we had a personal opportunity of following the various and gradual phases in the transformations of that force. At Pskov and Drugodevo, it happened very often that she could not control nor even stop its manifestations. After that, she appeared to master it more fully every day, until after her extraordinary and protracted illness at Tiflis, she seemed to defy and subject it entirely to her will. This was proved by her stopping any such phenomena at her will, and by previous arrangement for days and weeks at a time. Then, when the term was over, she could produce them at her command, and leaving the choice of what should happen to those present. In short, as already said, it is the firm belief of all that there where a less strong nature would have been surely wrecked in the struggle, her indomitable will found somehow or other the means of subjecting the world of the invisibles, to the denizens of which she has ever refused the name of spirits and souls, to her own control. Let it be clearly understood, however, that H.P.B. has never pretended to be able to control veil spirits, that is, the spiritual monads, but only elementals, as also to be able to keep at bay the shells of the dead.